Montgomery, but later on did become a supportive person to him. And that was a strange kind of relationship. But I think that it was a matter of the son winning over the father, that the father began to see the wisdom of the way he operated. But fought him very much. He was an autocrat for sure. Spanked him till he was, I don't know, up to 15 or 17 years old. He was a strong character. Okay. No. Well, the question is asked in relation to Gandhi, who had many personal problems, had trouble getting along with his wife and with his kids. How did Martin Luther King do with his family? Well, in many ways he did well. It's interesting, when Coretta heard the tape that the FBI sent, her response to it was, well, it doesn't prove much of anything about his behavior. In other words, she really defended him. She was a strong ally, and I think in many ways they had a good relationship all the way through. He loved his kids. I think they adored him, and he spent time with them and knew ways to play with them and so on. And I think it was a much healthier kind of relationship than Gandhi had with his family. I don't think you get in Martin Luther King the kind of repressed sense that you get in Gandhi. It's interesting, Gandhi had all that stuff pushed down, and it was going to come out somehow. I don't get that impression with Martin Luther King. My sense is that he had himself together, dealt with his drives, in other ways than repressing them, and therefore was able to deal better with people. When he went to India, he came away terribly taken with Gandhi and Gandhi's approaches. And he said that he said, I'm going to fast one day a week and pray one day a week. I'm modeling myself after Gandhi. And he really couldn't do it. Oppressive duties and so on just kept him from really functioning that well. And I think in many ways that hurt him. He was always busy, always tired. After he went to India, he learned to live on 4 hours sleep a night. And that was about average, and a lot of times he didn't get that. And so he was constantly tired. One time, when he finally wrote his last book, he went to Jamaica for 6 weeks and just stayed there secluded away from all telephones and got that last book written, Why We Can't Wait. Gandhi was influential on him, but I see Martin Luther King in ways moving beyond Gandhi. That is, I think he had a more universal sense than Gandhi did. Gandhi was pretty much there in India and dealing with those people. Martin Luther King had a sense for the white poor in the United States, for the suffering in Vietnam, for especially in Africa, and for a worldwide brotherhood, sisterhood. I think he had an excellent sense of that. And in that way, I think I see him as a broader vision somehow than Gandhi had. And certainly less repressed and better in his personal relationships. More well-balanced. I would tend to agree with that. He dealt well with his aides. Dealt well with the people who hurt him. He really practiced this thing. There was times when he'd be angry at people, but he wouldn't take it out on them. He really tried to love the people who disagreed with them. He even went to Hoover for a personal talk with him about all this to try to get it straightened out. He confronted, it's interesting, people who find it hard to suck in their guts and say to their husbands or wives or children what they're angry about and so on, find a tremendous model in Martin Luther King. He went right to them. Whether it was the president, FBI director, or whatever, other black leaders, he would call them in. Let's talk it over. Marvelous way, and he did it without rancor. Marvelous. Yeah. Well, if one was going to write a psychohistory a la Erickson, I think that the sexual aspect would come into it heavily. Hoover was one of those celibate fellows, and bachelor, And what bugged him the most was the sexual activity. He really went after King on 3 counts. One, that he was a communist. Constantly tried to make links with communism. There was this one guy, Levison, who worked closely with King, who had some minor dealings with communists in his past. And Hoover was convinced that he was the link with the international communist conspiracy. And this guy. And so Kennedy tried to get King to get rid of this guy, and eventually the guy resigned from King's staff in order to get this monkey off his back, so to speak. But he kept being a private advisor to King. And later on he sort of came back into the picture. So it was communism first of all. Then it was financial things. He had this elaborate thing showing why he was guilty of fraud and had money in a Swiss bank and all kind of complete fabrications. But what really got him was the sexual activity. Hoover's language about King, I don't think you'd want to repeat the way he talked about him. And he saw him as a sexual deviant. And how could a moral degenerate, and how could he lead a peace crusade? So I myself think that you probably got 2 roots of this. One is the fact that King criticized the FBI, and second, that there was something about his sexual life that just sent Hoover into a tizzy, that stirred up his thinking and his emotions. Yeah, Yes, Ernie?
I'm somewhat taken off guard in your summary when you talked about guilt and sin and the relationship with my father. You talked about potential dangers of life safety as well as about
Well, first I'm bouncing off of King's own responses. In his sermons, you get clear indications, if you know the sexual history to some degree, or at least that there was those kind of extramarital affairs going on, you can see it in here. He'll talk about the war that's inside of people and the 2 natures. So one thing is, that's just the way he experienced life, and he portrayed it that way, and he knew firsthand the truth that of the doctrine of original sin, that there's a propensity to evil that exists in the heart of all people. And as I said with Paul, we don't do the things we know we should do. So I think that's the first side of why it comes out. And the other side is that as he failed in Chicago, his mind turned more to Niebuhr's analysis than to the liberal Protestants. That is, he became convinced that the average white person in the United States was not interested in racial justice and racial harmony. He said he saw more hate on the faces of the people in Cicero, Illinois, than he ever saw in the South, the white people there. And the epitaphs thrown at him and so on, and somebody threw a rock and hit him in the head and so on in one of the Chicago marches. And that really made him doubt something that he had really held on to all the way along, that there was a fund of goodwill among the majority of white Americans. And he began to doubt that, except for, as he said, a lot of young people who felt differently. So he saw the social evil as well. So I'm just bouncing off of those realities. Then my analysis of human nature is indeed, as other people have heard me lecture on this other times, that we are simply threatened by sin and guilt as people. That any full explanation of human freedom has to factor that in. That it's possible to live in self-contradiction. That is the strange mystery about us. We can choose against the source of our very life. We can go against the mystery that lovingly surrounds us and grounds our very ability to choose. And that is why that's what produces, in my mind, healthy guilt. There's obviously neurotic guilt when we're guilty about something we don't have any control over, a minor matter, or all that people grew up with. But in my mind, there's a healthy and proper guilt that has an emotional tinge to it that tells me I'm living in self-contradiction. That's why I think we get fatigued a lot. When one is living in guilt, one's more tired than usual, I think. I think that's one of the things that happens. And that's because the energy flow is blocked. The normal energy can't work right. I think that's a lot of times we feel just when we're off-center within our relationships, we haven't treated someone right, there's that blockage. We can feel it, and that's what I talk about, clearing the air. If I can go and say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, or let's talk that over. Clearing the air is like ridding the block and allowing the good energy to flow again. I think that's a standard analysis in a sense. I mean, I think people can know the meaning of that kind of analysis. And I think it's vital. I'll go back to the thing, of Carl Menninger, a quote often, whatever became of sin. Menninger said that when clergy in the United States quit talking about sin, that the whole culture was impoverished. That indeed psychoanalysts then had to deal with the problem that there was this vague guilt feeling over the culture as a whole, over people's whole lives as a whole, because they couldn't say, on this occasion, I did wrong. And that as long as we can't do that, we don't understand the full scope of our freedom. And I suppose to complete my analysis that I'm bouncing off of a cultural tendency to deny that. Self-actualization without the pain or the possibility of contradiction. Freedom is what our root possibility of choosing against our best interests. It's possible to do that. Yeah, I think it is. And that's the Christian doctrine of original sin. That there is a tendency to evil in our hearts and in the culture as a whole. The other part of the analysis is that the culture leads us that way. Martin Luther King often said the problem, in his early life at least, the problem was that the white people in the United States simply didn't know. How many people went to Selma or came back and told us about Selma for the first time their consciousness was raised? For the first time they understood that black people couldn't use toilets in the South and what that might mean to a person's dignity and worth. It changed many people's lives. Many of us had no perception of that, no sense of what it meant to be oppressed here in the United States, that the dream wasn't real for a large part of the people. I suppose many people who missed the 60s learned that from Roots on television. I think maybe that's another way in which people came in touch with the evils of the slave system that still, we suffer from today. So the evil is systemic and structural, and that's what King learned early in his studies and really grew to know firsthand as he encountered unjust institutions. Kevin? Yeah. Good question asked about Malcolm X. Malcolm X, at the beginning of his life, while he was in jail, was on charges of abetting prostitution, I think, and other things like that. While he was in jail, came to the teachings of Muhammad through Elijah Muhammad, the leader in the United States. And it said fundamentally that all white people are devils. Blanket statement, all white people are devils, and the only thing you could do was fight against them, and violence was a proper means of doing that. And during that period of time, Malcolm X really disliked Martin Luther King, tore him down, called him an Uncle Tom, said he was misguided, and so on. Martin Luther King's reaction was, as it was when most black leaders didn't understand him, was sort of a compassionate sense of loving them anyway and hoping he could bring them around. Then, interestingly enough, it was during the the Birmingham period, get this straight, when Malcolm X, another time when he was in jail. The dates are escaping me here. But, go back one step. What happened to Malcolm X is he went to Mecca, got out of jail, went to Mecca, pilgrimage, and learned there real teaching of Muhammad. The real teaching of Muhammad, of course, wasn't as overlaid with racism as he had learned it among the black Muslims in the United States. And he was converted in that experience. It was a major turnaround in his life where he now saw that black and white were equal, that we had to have brotherhood in the world, and that whiteness wasn't a matter of skin color, but the devil existed in the oppressor. And that it wasn't a matter of black versus white, and violence wasn't going to get any place. He came down to the South while Martin Luther King was in jail to confer with him, or I think to give condolences, empathy, and couldn't get to him, and met with Coretta King, Martin's wife, expressed these things to Martin through his wife. And Martin Luther King was very taken with this conversion, saw it again as the power of love in the world. And Malcolm X went back to New York and within a few weeks was gunned down. You know, remarkable history we have in the United States of when people get to some point of universal brotherhood, sisterhood. The visionaries who seem to attain some sense of what the world is about. Think of 1968. What happened? You know, the people that we lost there, with Martin Luther King dying, Robert Kennedy, after he seemed to himself have a conversion experience and be very in tune with the disadvantaged, killed, and Thomas Merton, the other great Universalist of that time, killed. 1968 was just, you know, a horrendous year for the leadership. Anyway, so I think Martin Luther King was tremendously taken with Malcolm X's gesture and saw it as a triumph of love, I think, and of the power of God. And I think Malcolm X would have been a marvelous force for good in the civil rights movement. May have well teamed up, began to see things in more of a nonviolent way. Those are remarkable years, aren't they? I mean, just to think back through them and have some sense of that. 68 too, that was the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which is so terrible. A time when Eugene McCarthy beat Johnson in the primary in March in New Hampshire, and Johnson decides to pull out of the race. I mean, it's just, you know, an incredible turning point year in so many ways. The year of the snake, was it? Yeah. Freedom. Yeah.
Why do you think there are no blacks here?
I don't know that specifically. I think the call was made to the Black Student Union to tell them about it. Well, it's not. First, we have a problem of communication. That is, most of the people who know about the lectures like this and who come to most things like that, I suppose, are predominantly Catholic. And we don't have a high percentage of blacks in this area who are Catholic. That's probably one reason. The other reason is a great difficulty we have in communicating our programs and so on to the young people around here, which would include the black population. Thirdly, it could well be that blacks aren't interested in listening to a white person talk about Martin Luther King, and one could well understand that. A lot of blacks, I suppose, would feel that that isn't proper, or what does a white person, a theologian, has he gained credentials in any way with them to be able to speak about that? And I could have great empathy with that position. I think it's too bad. It would be great, to have a mix and to hear their viewpoint. One of the things that, again, to take off on that, it seems to me that when we live in any kind of a situation in our life when we don't have access to people who think differently from ourselves, who are different, we really are impoverished. I mean, to go through life living with white middle-class people is really deadening in many ways. I mean, it's to miss so much of the richness, the culture of what's in our world. And that's what King saw. I won't be able to put my hands on a quote quickly, I don't imagine. King saw the black people as really sort of a hope for the whites. Gandhi thought this, and King did too, that perhaps, I guess I'm not going to find it, that by the blacks interacting with the whites and touching our conscience and giving us a sense of their own history and their different perceptions of things could help us get around many of our own particular difficulties. The kind of rigidities that we might know in our life, puritanical tendencies, individualistic tendencies that they had learned to overcome, all kind of richness. So I think that indeed it is a shame, it's symptomatic of our own time, I suppose. A pastor of a black parish is here. Maybe he can, Bernie, you want to, veteran of the Selma March, you want to say anything about that, why blacks aren't here?
I think they would have a different kind of theologizing.
Very true.
Theologizing, we use all kinds of different imagery, experiences, and to get into all the heavy philosophy, not be in there. I find that difficult for dialogue with black ministers about the truth. Have a theology about it. It's all different kind of language. They have to learn to be able to be always in the concrete, not in the abstract category.
Yeah.
Another whole dialogue.
I'm having the privilege of preaching at a black church this Sunday, which I'm looking forward to. I've been reading sermons of Martin Luther King all week. I'm getting the style down, and I'm preparing a homily which I think fits in. Now, we're doing a pulpit exchange with a black minister in our Corpus Christi parish here, and I told him, I said, now, Franklin, you have 10 minutes to preach here, and that's it. And I said, now, when I'm at your place, what should I do? He says, well, I don't want you to go over an hour. He said, half hour to 45 minutes is good, and not over an hour. So I'm going to be in my glory Sunday, Anybody want to come to church? But I'm hopeful of doing this. I've been wanting to do this. I preached in situation half black, half white in the past. But I think that's one of the things that I learned from that. I mean, they have a marvelous rapport that occurs very often in their church services. And one who would watch Martin Luther King preach and people respond would understand that they were feeding him energy. And in the white church, I myself get much of my energy from faces. When I preach, I always look for or give talks. I find faces early that are responsive and so on. I feed off of that. In other words, that gives me the spark or what I try to gain from those responsive faces. And I think that that's very limited response, however. And what I see happening in the black churches is that there's a much more vocal and bodily kind of response. Martin Luther King had a great problem with that early in his life. He couldn't stand what he thought was the over-emotionalism in the black churches and the lack of intellectual integrity. It's interesting to read his sermons. As Bernie said, well, they are very concrete. They use metaphor in a marvelous way. Of course, I think that Martin Luther King is the greatest orator I ever heard. I mean, we hear tapes of FDR and Churchill, and I was a great fan of Kennedy as an orator and so on. But my own opinion is that Martin Luther King is the greatest orator that I ever heard, anyway. And I think it flows exactly from what Bernie said, that is the tremendous concreteness of his imagery. These sermons are masterpieces, but what I'm able to discern behind them is the theology. He carried with him a remarkable intellectual understanding of 19th, 20th century theology, and it's in here. And he didn't, he used the names. I mean, the names of the philosophers and theologians and great thinkers are in here. He's not afraid to use their names, and these were preached in the Ebenezer Baptist Church and the Dexter Avenue Church and so on. One woman said something about those usages. Well, I don't know those names. I don't know who those people are, but I get the message. You know, it comes across what he had to say. So it's not just, and he uses some of those things I read to you. That first comment on freedom is really quite a philosophical explanation and is right from one of his sermons. So he was not loath to do that. He overcame that emotional, that lack of intellectualism which he was worried about. But he did it in a way that communicated. And I think that's that reciprocity that went on. He had a marvelous command of the group. And very often he was inspired. I remember seeing films of him one time. There was, one of my keys, I think, in life is to achieve what I think to successful living is what I call a detached intimacy. That what is needed in life very often is to combine those two things, that one is involved and close and caring, but in such a way that one does not lose one's critical faculties. That's the intimacy, closeness, no limit to that, but not the head over heels, not the thing where my rational faculty would desert me and I wouldn't be able to think my way through what's going on. And as I observe Martin Luther King, he comes across to me as one of the prime examples of that. I have a scene in mind where there's all this emotion and people are clapping and the crowds are swaying and everything, and he's into it, but I can tell it's not going to keep him from saying what needs to be said. He's not going to say what that audience wants to hear. The inspiration is there. Now, I think Kennedy in his great Berlin talk, many people claim that he got carried away and said things he shouldn't have said then. He was inspired and moved and so on, and some people claim that by departing from his text that he went too far and so on, although I think he had that same quality. But I think Martin Luther King preserved the objectivity, kept his critical faculties going. Anyway, I give it a try Sunday morning. I have to say how that goes. Trying to catch the rhythm and give and take of that situation and to feed off of what is given and not just be a giver. Yeah, Ben?
I'd like to comment about liberating theology. It struck me as that I don't like that tendency to analyze spectrum.
Yeah.
It seems to be the other side of the coin that somehow it all ties into justice, but I don't dominate. I don't use anything that I have, my power, my knowledge, my possessions, to dominate anyone else. And so that comes across so strong. Liberation theologian, the Luke's gospel, where you first saw the other earthly kings lorded over, and be that way with you. If you want to be great in my kingdom, I want to be the servant of everyone. So that somehow we haven't had the ability to get across to see that somehow in terms of the larger society is not living up to the sense of the Christian gospel by utilizing its laws and its ability to political clout to find a power for themselves and accumulate. Those people are oppressed, and somehow we haven't been able to translate that into common consciousness and awareness, which the liberation theologians are doing, and it seems to be somehow I thought you reflect on that.
Yeah. Bernie mentions liberation theology, which is largely associated with Latin and South America. People like Gustavo Gutierrez and, strangely enough, Leonardo, what's his last name? Smith, yes. Leonardo Boff, Bernie's friend. That's why he brought him up. But Father Boff's friend, who we hope to have come here sometime, right? Speak to us in Portuguese about liberation theology. Anyway, a lot of that's rooted in Latin and South America and is rooted out of the experience of being oppressed and of trying to look at the world, the Christian message, from the viewpoint of those who are downtrodden. Now, all through theology, throughout all history, has been done the other way. It's been done by academics who got it made, who live in a neat world, and people like myself who have all the luxuries and comforts and so on. And the liberation theologians say that that's given us a distorted view of the Christian gospel. That when you start looking at it all from down under as part of the oppressed, then you see different things in the gospel that you didn't see before. And their great insistence is to begin in the human situation and to try to, out of that, grab hold of the contradictions found there. And they're not loath to use Marxist categories to do that, to find the contradictions in a capitalistic world, so on. And then they move out of that into many common themes, like a God of the Exodus, as I talked about, who freed his people from political economic slavery, about Jesus, who is seen as the liberator, Luke's gospel, as Bernie says, who came to free the captives, of a church that's supposed to be a community of people struggling for freedom in the world, and of a law of Christian charity that's supposed to move us to encounter institutions and structures and not just to give a food basket to individuals to feed them, to use political clout to get someplace. So that's what liberation theology is fundamentally. And as Bernie says again, one of their tenets is to try to avoid the same mistake that oppressors have always made, that is, when one gets on top, to somehow lord it over. That's one of the beauties of Martin Luther King, that he always insisted we're not out to defeat anybody, never tell them we defeat them, don't act that way, we're out to love them. And we're going to love everybody, and he loved Stokely Carmichael when he tore him down, and Malcolm X when he tore him down, and continued to try to dialogue with J. Edgar Hoover. So that represents that style. Now, out of that, you see, I would say the problem is you can't, in my mind, totally import what Leonardo Boff, as good a friend as he is of yours, says in the United States, because our situation is different. We don't have the same class structure that oppresses people in Latin and South America. We have a very different situation. Therefore, it seems to me we have to develop our own indigenous liberation theology, and I see our friend Martin Luther King as a perfect example of that. And I would think that he is a man who worked out of the experience of the blacks in the United States, was able to articulate it, relate it to the gospel of love. Therefore, he saw things in the gospel that the rest of us never saw. And a propensity to freedom and to confront structures that many other Christians simply didn't perceive at all in the Christian tradition. I see him as a good example of that. I think that to complete the picture, you're going to need for example, women theologians who work out of the experience of women's sense of oppression in the United States to give us that. Probably going to need Hispanic theologians to do that as well. We're not going to import it from Latin and South America. We need people in the United States who try to work out of our own experience. As much as I said in my own book on Karl Rahner, that the response to Rahner is not to be a disciple, not to try to take Rahner's thought and try to give it to white, educated Christians in the United States, but to try to figure out how to do in a creative way what he did in his German academic context. And that's what theologians have to do. Now, Bernie and I have a running fight on this whole matter, which might as well come out, Bernie, here in front of this whole group. And that is that I maintain that my own methodology does what he says. Now, if you try to, what I tried to do tonight, in my mind, is an example of this. I didn't start in abstractions. I started with the life of a man, of life situation, and what he was going through. And out of that, tried to draw some sort of a sense of what freedom might be all about. And it seems to me that is a viable methodology. One doesn't have to use Marxist categories to do that. I mean, Martin Luther King's a good example of that. He really had no use for Marxism. He showed all the way along that it was not a good way of looking at what was going on in the United States. Although, I must say, as he moved later in his life, he became more radical. And many people noticed that he became more and more convinced that we needed a more complete revolution in the United States if we were really going to achieve the justice we were looking for. But he never became, in my mind, a Marxist type thinker. Anyway, I agree with the thrust of liberation theology. We got to begin where we are. And that's not just for people like me who have the luxury of reading books and writing articles, but for all thinking people. It's not just a matter of taking a catechism we learn, or a scripture book that we read, or a church teaching that was handed down to us, and trying to take that preformed package and apply it, but it is to take seriously our own experience of life, to try to immerse ourselves in it, wrestle with it, understand it, and use the gospel to illuminate it. That's a very different thing from taking what your mother told you and trying to apply it. It's like night and day. It's like a totally different methodology. And I think that other methodology is a beginning and experience is crucial for all of us in the 20th century, living in the modern world. We can't just repeat what other people have said, seems to me. We need to make an effort to understand it and then allow the tradition of scriptures, the church teaching, to illuminate it, to help us understand it better. Again, I would think that's part of the methodology I would try to use tonight. Bernie? Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate the lead-in. That's important. And I think I didn't link him explicitly, but I would consider him to be an example of an American liberation theologian and doing exactly what Leonardo Boff is doing down in his area. Going to make this last one, yeah.
As long as liberation theology came up, how would you contrast that with Gandhi or Martin Luther King in terms of violence? I know one person particularly is very critical of liberation theology because it's associated with violence.
Yes. Well, I would say my own reading of the liberation theologians, I don't see nonviolence stressed as much as it surely was in Gandhi or in King as a methodology. I don't think that's their primary concern. Unfortunately, in some of the fringes of that movement, you do get indications that perhaps violence is needed to overcome the oppression. And I'm not sure that is really a very helpful thing. You know, I remember talking to a priest. He was down in Guatemala. He formed little groups. He was nonviolent when he went down there. Formed little groups. They get around and talk about the scriptures, no big thing. Little consciousness raising. He'd find one of the members missing. Sometimes tortured, sometimes killed for nothing, sitting around like this. He told me, all honesty, he said, if I had the chance, I'd kill the 14 families who own 98% of the wealth there. So that's where I'm at now. And that hit me. You know, it's one thing to stand here and say, well, I'm going to be nonviolent. Now, it's another thing to be in Guatemala when the guy sitting next to you is taken away and what he end up doing. Now, this priest, really turned to violence, as we know other clergymen have in Latin America, because they see the terrible oppression and there seems to be no way out to them. The marvel of Martin Luther King is that he couldn't be turned away from it. And the same with Gandhi. Whether you think they're right and wrong, their devotion to principle is almost hard to believe. He's slapped around and he won't defend himself. He's thrown in jail and he tries to love those people anyway. The woman comes up and stabs him and he forgets it. He forgives her. He did it in action. And that's why many people have said the great theologian of the 20th century is really Martin Luther King, because he didn't just talk it, he lived it. That is a remarkable thing. He was nonviolent even though he was yelled at, called everything. His wife was attacked. His kids were attacked. His house was firebombed. He was in jail 20 times, unjustly treated, vilified. Always turned the other cheek. It is hard for him at times. He couldn't, it was, he would say that we could feel the anger well up and he'd control it. He could feel his despondency take over. He'd look for hope, the dream. Remarkable figure. We'll meet next week. We'll talk about Hammarskjöld and the question of time. I'll probably spend less time on his life and more time dealing with that important, essential question of how we deal with time. And the final one will be on Teilhard de Chardin. We got a big room. Feel free to bring any friends next week. We'll see you then. Yes, Martin Luther King and the struggle for freedom. So we're going to talk about this great apostle of freedom who worked for it and spoke glowingly about it. And just an example of one of those quotes that was so special to him, taken partly from a Negro spiritual. And he said this on one occasion: "When we let freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, 'Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.'" And the last phrase is, of course, what they put then on Martin Luther King's tombstone, "Free at last," a phrase that he loved and used so often in his talks. Now we go back really to the beginning, his own early years. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, January 15th, 1929. And I think one important thing right away is to see he grew up in a middle-class black family. He didn't really know the kind of grinding poverty and indignities that many of the other blacks in the country at that time did know. He was an extremely bright youngster. He could memorize things so rapidly. He skipped many grades. In fact, he entered Morehouse College in Atlanta at the age of 15. So we're dealing with a man of fine intelligence. He did no discrimination. I just took out a couple of events that occurred in his life. When he was a little boy, before school, he used to play with a white youngster. And they were very close friends and so on. But when it came time to go to school, of course, the schools were segregated. They had to separate and really couldn't be friends anymore. And he said, why is that? And it was at that time that his parents had to explain to him about segregation, much as he had to explain to his own daughter later on when she wanted to go to a carnival place in Atlanta and wasn't allowed to go. He was a youngster very early, had to tell the stories, and really in his own heart a real hatred for white people began to develop because of that. And one other event was a time when he was on a bus. He was really a junior in high school, and of course the buses were segregated and the blacks sat in the back. But if the front was filled and white people got on, then the blacks had to get up and the whites sat in their place in the back. And this was a long trip he was on, and the driver told him to move, and he didn't move right away to get up to give the seat to the white boys that got on. And then he yelled at him, he says, "You black son of a bitch, you better get out of there." And he got up and left him sit, and he said that he was never so furious in his life. We see a certain parallel to Gandhi here in these early experiences in their life when they felt something so strongly and really had to find a way to deal with that throughout his life. At the age of 5, he made official membership in his Baptist church, and at 17, he became a pastor. The Baptist community is sort of called to that task, and at 17, preached his first sermon under the watchful eyes of his father, who was a minister as well. At the beginning, when he was learning all of this stuff, he really didn't like the religion he was getting. It was too much of a fundamentalism. And it was only when he got to Moorhead College and encountered a good professor who taught him something about modern biblical criticism, that there was a truth behind those stories in the Bible, that he really could begin to accept Christianity and to get over a lot of his doubts. Okay, that's first something about his up through college, a summary thing. That's what I'm going to do with the various sections of his life, and then pause and say something about what it is that we're trying to learn here. The first thing that I want to get out of this is that we are really freely responsible for ourselves. That we're not just totally determined by our environment, and we're not just fatalistically thrust in one direction. That it really is possible, as Martin Luther King shows by his own life, to rise above one's circumstances. The one is free in it. I learned this from my father. My father always thought that Freudian stuff was a bunch of baloney, that we were programmed in early life. And he sort of drummed that into my head, that one is indeed not programmed, but that one has choices to make in life. And I've always been grateful to him for instilling that kind of thing, that one really has the ability to take hold. There's somebody, B.F. Skinner is a good example of a person who denies this. Skinner thinks we're totally programmed by our environment, that we're not free. He has a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, where he says that to talk about freedom just messes our head up. He says that we are nothing more than a bundle of responses to stimuli, that we are completely determined in our life. And, of course, the whole life and teaching of Martin Luther King really goes against all of this and suggests a whole other approach which says, no, we are free, we're responsible for ourselves. So what is freedom, then, at root? It seems as though it's the ability to take hold of our lives, the ability to shape our character, the ability to set a direction for ourselves, the ability to take up a stance vis-a-vis all of the givens, all the environment, all the determinisms that we have around us. So I would like to think that no matter where someone shows a determinism, I'm determined to do something by my environment or my genes, it still seems to me that we can root freedom in our fundamental ability to take up an attitude towards all of that. My own mentor, Karl Rahner, liked to talk about freedom as the capacity for the eternal. He used to say that freedom isn't the ability just to change our mind, to do this or that, get up, come to class, not come to class, but that freedom is the ability to determine who we will be forever. That all what we're doing in life is shaping our very being, determining how we will live as we pass through the barrier of death. Puts a tremendous weight on our individual decisions. Puts a tremendous weight on taking hold of our lives and not just drifting. Someone once said one of the worst things in life would be to wake up in old age and say, I never took hold. I never really grabbed my own life. I just went along with the crowd, or I just did what was expected of me. I never really grabbed hold. Jean-Paul Sartre made an interesting comment about freedom. He said we were never so free as during the Nazi occupation and during the resistance in France. Never so free as at that time. Because he said the stakes were high. One was forced to choose to be a collaborator or a resistor. It had nothing to do with the external circumstances, in other words. In that perspective, one could be very free in prison. One could be very free in a relationship that one wasn't happy about. One could be very free no matter what else was going on, because freedom is rooted in the ability to take up an attitude towards all of those determinisms or givens in one's life. And so that is the first thing that I think I'd like to say. As Sartre said again, we are condemned to be free. Condemned to be free. We can never chuck it off. We can't get rid of that root power and terrible responsibility that we are responsible for our lives as a whole. Now, let me read you something again from Martin Luther King on this whole business about his notion of freedom, and you'll see how close a lot of this comes here. He's responding here to the fatalists, those people who are saying we're just fated to be in a certain way. Now, Martin Luther King had a sense of fate. He felt, like many great people, that they were fingered by destiny, that they had a role to play. I see that coming up over and over in these great people. They know they're special. They know they got a role to play in life. So he's got that down. There's a destiny about his life. So he's playing with that in his own mind. He says, but he rejects a total fatalism. He says, because freedom is a part of the essence of man. The fatalist, by denying freedom, becomes a puppet, not a person. One of his favorite metaphors there. We're persons, not puppets. He is, of course, right in his conviction that there is no absolute freedom, and that freedom always operates within the context of predestined structure. So he's ready to admit that. However, he says freedom is always within the framework of destiny, but there is freedom. We are both free and destined. Freedom is the act of deliberating, deciding, and responding within our destined nature. Even though destiny may prevent our going to some attractive place, we do have the capacity to accept such a disappointment, to respond to it, and to do something about the disappointment itself. But fatalism stymies the individual, leaving him helplessly inadequate for life. So what do we get out of this? I suppose it comes down to saying that when you look at Martin Luther King's life, one is sort of moved to take hold. One is moved to say, where am I drifting, and where do I have to decide, and where do I have to do something about all of this? So now I'll take up next phase of his life, which deals with his studies now. And the interesting thing is, you read about Martin Luther King, he really had a top-notch mind. And he assimilated the theological thought that was available in his world and really practically put it into use. There's been articles written that claim that he's the great theologian of the 20th century, even though he only wrote about 4 or 5 books and didn't have time to do much more than that. But that he really did assimilate and put together in a remarkable way. So in 1948, at the age of 19, he went to Crozer Seminary. I always make that mistake. That is a Freudian slip. For anybody who knows how bad seminaries were in my day when I was going through them, were more like cemeteries. Anyway, a lot of that, he wanted to get out of Atlanta. He really wanted to get away from his father. His father was a really autocratic person. His father put the screws on him, tried to tell him what to do. He was really a dominating force in his life. He felt the need to get away. And he also knew that Crozer Seminary really was a good place to study, had a good reputation. And he really went at it. He was a terrific student. And he would pick up the things that made sense to him in terms of his background, in terms of this whole struggle for freedom. I don't know how much people are into this. I'll go through these names sort of quickly, but in my world they're important. To other people, I don't know. But one person he picked up was Walter Rauschenbusch, great Baptist theologian at the turn of the century, in the early part of the 20th century. He lived in New York and helped the poor. And he preached the social gospel. And Rauschenbusch was convinced of this, that the kingdom of God was not just something in the afterlife, but the kingdom of God was here and now. And we had the job of establishing it here on earth. And if we would get with it and get social legislation passed and help the poor and so on, we could almost create that kingdom right here on this earth. He wasn't too big on the capitalistic system. He saw the inequities of that system, and that started ringing bells in Martin Luther King's head as well. This time he also studied Marxism, and rejected it, and really rejected it throughout his life. And that is important because he was constantly hounded with the charge that he was a communist. And J. Edgar Hoover, as we'll see, went after him with that charge continuously. And it's interesting, all the way through, he always rejected Marxist philosophy completely and totally, wrote articles on it and so on. None of that sunk into J. Edgar Hoover's head, however. Then he used to go off and find good lectures wherever he could find them. That's always an important part of being in an academic setting. And one time he went to Philadelphia, and he heard this lecture on this magnificent fellow by the name of Mohandas Gandhi. And his whole idea of satyagraha, truth force, power and nonviolence. And he was just thrilled with that, and he took to it, and he went home and he started reading his autobiography and read everything he could get his hands on, and that became a major part of his thinking from then on. Much later, in 1959, he went to India and went to Gandhi's shrine and talked to all the people he could find who knew Gandhi, and just really was drinking in that whole nonviolent philosophy, and that became a continuing part of his approach throughout his whole life. Then by his senior year in this seminary then, he really was faced with this kind of problem that he couldn't resolve. He was a product of what we call liberal Protestant thought, which saw human nature as fundamentally good. And he bought into that until some guy, on 2 different occasions, people pulled guns on him and were ready to shoot him. One of his fellow students was going to do it because he didn't like black people. Another, in a restaurant, that same thing happened to him. Well, when he began to get doses of this, this whole idea of that human nature is fundamentally good becomes questionable. And he wrestled with that. And he read another important author, Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr's idea is big on evil, that there's a lot of evil in the world. The human heart's messed up, and that social structures are messed up. And so he was getting 2 messages. And he really didn't know how to put those 2 things together. Did he think people are bad, or did he think people are fundamentally good? And he couldn't really resolve that even when he finished his seminary studies. And then, so he graduated then from Crozer, and he decided to go on with his studies, and he entered Boston University in the theology department there and did further studies. And here he really went at it. He studied people like Hegel, studied the existentialists like Sartre and so on, and he began work on his doctoral dissertation, which he used partly the ideas of Paul Tillich, which are familiar at least to some people here. So, and he was very interested in this intellectual life. He thought of himself as probably getting out of there and being a theology professor someday. Loved the academic world and was really interested in putting these ideas together. As a result of his studies of Hegel, he thought he saw ways of getting all this thing in place. He began to take a middle position on human nature. He didn't really buy Niebuhr, and he really didn't buy the liberal Protestants either. He saw us as fundamentally good, created by God, but plagued with evil and sinfulness in many ways. And he had a powerful sense of the sinfulness in the social structures that we were immersed in, which he would have to have as part of, I guess, of his whole black heritage. Well, before he finished his dissertation, this is usually a mistake, but he left school before he finished it and went and took a job as a pastor in Montgomery at the Dexter Avenue church there. But with a lot of help from his wife, Coretta, who he had met in graduate school and married, accomplished musician who gave up her own musical career to marry him. And they formed a very good relationship in many ways, and she was very helpful to him. And even though he was a pastor of a parish, he did complete his dissertation finally, which again dealt with some of the thoughts in Paul Tillich. Now, what do I want to get out of this particular section of Martin Luther King's life? Well, what happened, of course, through his studies is he began to broaden out his notion of freedom. He began to deal with the social structures. As soon as he's talking about Gandhi and nonviolence, now he's talking about how you confront the establishment, How do you gain rights? As soon as he's talking about Reinhold Niebuhr, he's talking about a sense that the evil that's in the community is even larger and stronger than the evil that's in the human heart. It was one of Niebuhr's great ideas, that evil, once it gets outside our hearts and gets into structures and institutions, carries even a larger power. So, what do we have, in other words? We have Martin Luther King moving us in the direction of a very social notion of freedom. Not just in the first section, as I said, that I'm freely responsible for making myself who I will be forever, but I'm now immersed in a matrix of relationships. I'm in institutions. I'm relating to other people, and all of that has to do with the way I look at freedom. Now, in the United States, we really have trouble with that. We are a very individualistic kind of people for many reasons, because of the philosophy of John Locke, because of our frontier experience where if you didn't like something in one colony, you left it and went to another one. A lot of our experiences programmed us away from the collectivity, away from the social notion. One of our great images of that, which I use so often, I get tired of hearing myself say it, and that is the Marlboro Man. Should have worn my Marlboro coat tonight. You know, the Marlboro Man in our culture, I always say when I was working in the warehouse, I used to pile up Luckies, big cartons of Luckies, you know, about 50 of those to one Marlboro. Marlboro put a guy out on a horse, put a tattoo on his arm, and before long I'm piling up more Marlboros than I am Luckies. It was one of the most successful advertising campaigns in all of history, and it played to that individualistic notion of freedom, that freedom has to do with autonomy, of being free of ties, the cowboy image, being out alone, and that becomes the really enticing figure, especially for males in the American culture. All of that really comes down to us through the Enlightenment, through existentialist thought. And Kierkegaard, what he wanted to have on his tombstone was the individual. He thought of himself, you know, him in relationship to God. We have so much of that notion in the Western thought that indeed the great task of life is to take care of number one, private interest. Much of our Christian training is that way in terms of I'm going to save my soul. It's very much of a vertical notion of what religion is all about. So in the United States, in other words, we're constantly plagued with a privatism, an inability to figure out how we relate to other groups, how we get in touch with the community as a whole. And of course, Martin Luther King came to see that that's a faulty way. If you start that way, think of yourself as an individual and how you're going to relate, you'll never get there. He understood, as do many thinkers in the 20th century, that we are immediately social, that we're already related. We find ourselves in a matrix of relationships from the word go. We don't survive without parents who take care of us. We don't grow to maturity without people who can love us. We don't know who we are except people feed that back to us. So our identity is largely social, communal. And so we're immediately in this matrix of relationships. And part of the task, therefore, becomes to figure out how we're going to improve those relationships, be a functioning member of the community. Part of our freedom is to say, how can I improve the communities that I relate to? And so maybe the image we might get from Martin Luther King really is that the goal of human life is not independence and not to be dependent, but it is found in that phrase, interdependence. He loved to talk about the beloved community. The beloved community where we would be brought together with other people. And that's all those phrases I read to you, you know, love to go over those, black and white, Catholic and Protestant, you know, the poor and the well-to-do. All the people had to somehow make this rich mix that we would call the human community or the beloved community. Now, let me read you something from his thought that perhaps brings this out strongly. Perhaps I should preface this with the part of this he gets from the philosopher Hegel. Hegel is the one who told us that in the master-slave relationship, the master is as oppressed as the slave. That the well-to-do person is hurt as much by a pattern of injustice as the people at the lower rung. And that's not commonly thought, don't usually see it that way, but he was convinced of the truth of that, and that is partly what is behind this phrase that I read from one of his sermons. To our most bitter opponents we say this: we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We shall meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we shall continue to love you. We cannot in all good conscience obey your unjust laws, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. Throw us in jail, and we shall still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our community at the midnight hour, and beat us and leave us half dead, and we shall still love you. But be ye assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. One day we shall win freedom, but not only for ourselves. We shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we shall win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. In his early battles in the segregation, when they would win a victory, one of the major things that he would tell the followers and so on is, we haven't defeated them, we haven't defeated the white establishment, we've won a victory for justice. He would never lord it over, never inflict on the oppressor the same sort of values that they had used against the downtrodden people. That's a powerful, marvelous thing, isn't it? It reminds one of Gandhi in the movie. I suppose more people have seen it since last week now, where he tells the people, the British, he says, you will leave. And he says, you don't expect us to walk out of here, do you? Out of a whole country? And he said, yes, I do. Very simply. In other words, it will be simply a mutual understanding that's reached. Will come to the point where that is just the normal, logical thing to do. And that's what Martin Luther King, of course, was shooting for in his whole approach. So what do we have in the second section then? Trying to draw from his own intellectual studies, Gandhi, Rauschenbusch, Niebuhr, all those people with a social conscience is, freedom is a social entity. Freedom must be struggled for within community. And I suppose that his life would suggest to us that we do a little bit of searching for privatism within ourselves, and how much of the Marlboro Man image remains, and how much do we need to overcome that in terms of searching out freedom for ourselves. Now the next section of his life that I want to move to is 1956 and the time in Montgomery. I said he took a pastorate there, intended to be a sort of normal pastor for a while and then probably do some teaching later on. And he gets there, and some woman is on the bus sitting down and in her black section there where she's supposed to be, and some whites get on, and she is a tired woman, Rosa Parks by name, and the bus driver, as is usual, says, get up and let that white man sit down there, and Rosa was just too tired to get up and said, I'm not moving. And that started it. Oh, that's what they were looking for. And she was, of course, arrested and charged for this terrible crime. And that's what the black leaders were looking for, something to latch onto to begin to fight the segregation practices in the South. And they had a meeting about it, and Martin Luther King finds himself chosen as the leader of this group. Sort of thrust into it. Suddenly he's there. He had to give the first talk to the group. He had just a short period. He used to spend 15 hours preparing each one of his sermons. And here he had about 15 minutes to get his ideas together for this most important talk. How are we going to rally the community in Montgomery to do something about this? And it was then at that meeting that they adopted the first of their nonviolent tactics, that is, the boycott of the buses. And so they just decided, okay, we're not going to ride the buses. and they began to walk to work. They began to organize carpools, and the white establishment just fought them at every level. They tried to claim that those carpools amounted to a business, and they had to put them out of business. They did everything. This struggle went on for months and months, and it got down finally to in November, all through the year, this was going on. And finally, when it looked, they were in the courtroom, and it looked like they were going to lose a court battle. The decision came from the Supreme Court November 13th saying that the Alabama laws segregating the buses were unconstitutional. And there they had the really great experience, the great triumph, first great triumph of the nonviolent method. Of course, it thrust Martin Luther King into popularity. It showed that the nonviolence that Gandhi had preached could be effective in the United States, as Gandhi himself had prophesied in 1935. Martin Luther King had before him the tool in actual practice that he thought he had when he was doing his graduate studies. Also worth noting, I think, during this time, that he had a very powerful religious experience. And it was something like this. He was in his home, and there was all kind of, during these months, of course, he began to get these terrible phone threats. And they'd call him up and, the worst kind of language and so on, and tell him that he's going to be dead within a week and so on. And he was really despondent, and one night he couldn't sleep, and he was ready to give up the whole thing, and he went down into his kitchen, and he's sitting there and he's buried his head in his hands and felt the lowest point. And at that point, as he describes it, it was as though the Lord himself spoke to him, and that the Lord's presence was real to him. And the Lord said, in essence, I'll be with you through all this. Stand up for righteousness, Martin, and I will be with you through the whole thing. And at that moment, the despondency left him, and he found an inner strength, and it really carried him on. 3 days later, they bombed his house. And it's a terrible thing. When he heard it, he says he accepted it with great calm, was able to ride through that, and he attributed to this marvelous religious experience that he had in this particular time. Now, what do I want to get out of the Montgomery years, the 1956, this first great work of nonviolence? Third idea about freedom, and that is that freedom is a matter in part of having proper alternatives in life. You see, a lot of us experience freedom as having too many alternatives. Especially the young people today. It's like they're in a supermarket walking down the aisle. They can be anything they want. They can choose so many different options. They got so many different possibilities in life. And they're often thrown into an anxiety about that. It's a bewildering situation to have. And it's hard for one to know what to grab onto. How should one direct one's energies in life? It really is a new situation from a previous generation who felt locked into one religion that they were born into, or one way of life that they chose, or one job they picked early in their life, or whatever. It is a new world, in a sense, for many people. The problem is that one is overwhelmed with options, and one finds hard to make commitment and settle in and not be superficial and grab on to something with gusto and in some depth. But both the previous generation and so many people in the world today, it's just the opposite. They are, as one of our popes said, locked into a hellish circle of poverty. People who find themselves living in the ghettos in the United States don't have options. I mean, they can't figure out what to do. There doesn't seem to be any way out. To be unemployed today and a black teenager, it doesn't seem to be any way that one can really end up handling that. And so the problem of freedom, I think, becomes one of multiplying options, of giving people choices. And that is a lot, I think, of what Martin Luther King was about in those marches in the South. He used to say that even when the marches failed, One of the things that he felt good about is that he could see the blacks in the South walking taller. They now had a sense that they could fight. They had one more alternative. That is, you could, instead of just taking it, one could band together with others and fight against these segregationist policies and the discrimination they met in so many different ways. And so, in a world where 17% of the people have something like 80% of the wealth, there's a lot of people around who don't have options. And part of the whole business of freedom is trying to create those alternatives so that people see a way out of the hellish circle of poverty. Now, it could be that even an enlightened self-interest is going to have to tell those who have in the world to be attentive to this kind of problem. What are we in the United States? Are 6% of the world's population consume something like 40% of the world's resources. There's a lot of people out there who probably would like the resources that we have. In some sort of a geopolitical sense, there has to be a self-interest in saying we don't need a world where 2/3 or more of the people are after what we've got because they don't have anything. That's not a very healthy posture for we and the people in the United States to be in. So even out of an enlightened self-interest, those who have usually are better off somehow sharing or creating those alternatives for other people. But ultimately, the real thrust for this business of multiplying the alternatives is out of a faith perspective for Martin Luther King. That is, we belong to the brotherhood, and as we would add today, because Martin Luther King was into a lot of sexist language, yet brotherhood and sisterhood of all people, that all people are the sons or daughters of the great God and live in one community, and Christ died for all the people. The Spirit is present throughout, and therefore to deny some goods to some of the people in the world really is to impoverish ourselves in a psychic, emotional sense as well. And we have to remember from our own scriptures that it really is the God of the Exodus that we remember as the key figure in the Hebrew scriptures. And the God of the Exodus is the one who gave alternatives to his people. They were slaves in Egypt, and he gave them the alternative of their own land, of determining their own destiny. Interesting, they had trouble accepting that freedom when they were given it. Some of them wanted to go back to the slavery that they had in Egypt because it was too hard to have those alternatives. Martin Luther King found that very often with the black people. They weren't ready to have the freedom. It was too scary in a sense. And part of what he wanted to do was stiffen them and get them ready to accept that kind of responsibility. Let me read to you now a quote from Dr. King on this matter. Shorter quote, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to give it the flavor that it ought to have in context here. He says this, he gave a hard-hitting speech on Negro voting rights, says, let us make our intentions crystal clear. We must and we will be free. We want freedom now. We want the right to vote now. We do not want freedom fed to us in teaspoons over another 150 years. Under God, we were born free. Misguided men robbed us of our freedom. We want it back. He used to say that we don't come begging for freedom on our knees. Oh, it's not like something that's granted to us by other people. It's God-given right to all people. To have alternatives is the way the great God created us. And it is a terribly unjust situation when it is not working out in that fashion. So, I guess what do we want to get out of that? That is to have some empathy, I think, for people who have experienced the problem of freedom differently from ourselves. Many of us who have known options all our lives have trouble knowing what it's like not to have them. In fact, I don't think we can know it entirely. For some reason I'm flashing on the line from Ivan Denisovich, Solzhenitsyn. the prisoner in the Gulag, there's this guy sitting there, and he says, who doesn't understand his plight, he says, well, if you're warm, you can't possibly understand what it's like to be cold. Just a forceful line. I think, I'd probably say if you're white middle class, you can't know what it's like to be black in the United States and not have alternatives. Can't know what it's like to walk in and not to be able to use a drinking fountain because that's for whites only. Or to not be able to go in the store and order something and just sit down at a lunch counter and order a hamburger. To not have a bathroom to use. It was a great problem for the blacks traveling. No bathroom. Couldn't find one. Those were for whites only. Had to find a colored bathroom. They had trouble traveling because they couldn't find a place to stay. That's what it meant to have no alternatives, to live up, as he said, psychically scarred. When he told his daughter she couldn't go to Funtown because, and tried at 6 years old, had to explain to her why she couldn't go there. She saw the ad on television or something. Said, no, can't go there. And he had to tell her about, well, only white people can go there. And he said he looked at her eyes and he saw the first scars of discrimination forming there, or first perceptions that she was inferior somehow to the rest of the people, lacking the full range of alternatives that others had. Right now I want to run through some interim events till I get to the next important one that I want to take up, which is the story of Selma. Go through some of this now quickly, just fill it in. So we were up there dealing with 1956, right? Interesting for some of us of a certain age here. We can sort of check our own path here and always saying, where was I then, and what was I thinking, and what was I doing? It's sort of interesting. But in 1957, he was on the cover of Time magazine, become a well-known person. He founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Baird Rustin. And he completed his first book, Stride Toward Freedom. He always had trouble finishing his books because he had deadlines and all this call on his time, and really he had a lot of ghostwriters, and a lot of people ended up fixing up his material and so on, but he did publish that book. 1958, he was in a department store in New York, and a crazed woman came up and stabbed him, and was in here, took him to the hospital, and it was right next to his aorta, and the doctor, in a phrase that has been repeated often, said, if he had just sneezed then, he would have died. And a little girl wrote him a letter and said, Dr. King, I'm glad you didn't sneeze. And so he recovered from that, but that is, first, he was often violently treated, of course, but that was one where he really was in very close to death, 1958. 1960, in January, he left that Dexter Church in Montgomery and returned to Atlanta to his father's church. He got thrown into jail, and John Kennedy helped to get him out, something that many people felt helped to elect Kennedy. 1960, he got something like 3/4, I think, of the black vote then. In an election he won by, 125,000 votes or something. And so many thought that that gesture was an important thing. But interestingly enough, Martin Luther King did not really endorse Kennedy officially in that campaign, but sort of wanted to retain a certain neutrality or rise above the politics that was going on there. Distrusted Kennedy at first. Kennedy was a thorn in his side. He thought he could do great things but wouldn't do them. But as time went on, they got closer and closer together. He got pretty good access to the president, influenced a lot of his thinking, and Kennedy really tried to put into action a lot of the things that Martin Luther King wanted. 1962, he was in Albany, Georgia, with a very unsuccessful campaign, one of his first great failures, which caused a lot of soul-searching. And one of the things he did afterwards was blast the FBI agents for not being helpful in Albany. And it was then that the vendetta started with J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover at that point began to hate his guts and began to go after him with a vengeance, and that continued, and I'll tell more of that story later on, the way he pursued Martin Luther King. But that was the starting point of it, at least then in 1962. Okay, that's just to catch us up. Now, the next event I wanted to take in detail was Birmingham in 1963. Now, this brings in familiar figures to many of us. Bull Connor, saw his face on television a lot, the sheriff, and George Wallace, who wasn't going to let any of this integration stuff go on, and so on. Now, it was early in that campaign in Birmingham. Southern Christian Leadership Conference would pick a target city, have a particular idea in mind, go there, try to set up and organize things, and very often that would lead to confrontation, so he got thrown into jail. And while he was in jail, he got some things smuggled. He was like in solitary confinement for some minor misdemeanor, and they smuggled some writing materials into him and smuggled a newspaper in. And when he got the paper, it had an ad in it from 8 clergymen, prominent clergymen in Birmingham, saying, let's have peace, we don't need these demonstrations and so on, let's go at this gradually, we're going to make it all right, calm and reason must prevail. And it was at that point, using scraps of paper and so on, that Martin Luther King wrote the classic letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he told the ministers that you couldn't wait. Can't wait. We've been waiting for 100 years and nothing's happened. And he went on to give the classic defense of nonviolence and what he was all about. And a magnificent thing. I think there was 1 million copies of it available in a short period of time, reprinted all over, and of course gave many people their original feel for the whole nonviolent movement. It was a remarkable piece of work. He drew on his scholarship. He had no library there or anything. There's quotes from Thomas Aquinas and philosophers and so on. It's a marvelous piece of intellectual work, but mostly a passionate kind of document. And it was here in the Birmingham campaign that they first used the children. And he was roundly criticized that his idea, first of all, was to get high school students. They wanted to fill the jails. That was the whole idea. Get everyone arrested, fill the jails to show the ridiculous character of these segregationist so-called Jim Crow laws. You understand? That's what they were fighting. This stuff all the time. You couldn't use the bathrooms and the lunch counters and buses and all of that. And they wanted to gain those rights. So they sent the children out, and the high school students brought along a lot of the younger people yet. And that's when we got looking at on our television screen those dogs of Bull Connor going after the kids, vivid pictures in the minds of many of us, and the fire hoses trained on little kids. And for the first time, many people in the North began to have some sense of this whole terrible life situation of the blacks in the South. They put 3,000 people in jail, and many people said it really was the face of Bull Connor with the hate against those little kids that really began to get many whites in the North thinking about the problem of racism in our country. And he had another success. The administration wouldn't give in. Bull Connor was running for mayor. There's no way he was going to give in. There was big fights among the government people, but the business people capitulated. The business people, they're not making any money, and they decided that they would desegregate their businesses. And they made an agreement with King and his people, and there was a real sense here of tremendous success. And it was then in the light of that whole success that he led the Washington March, August 28, 1963, 250,000 people in Washington, and he was allowed to speak last at that. The black leaders were all addressing the people, and he was given 8 minutes to speak. And in that he prepared his talk, and he prepared one kind of talk that he had thought about in Detroit earlier and had a lot to do about his own dream. But then he gave that up and gave another image about having a check that would bounce. The blacks didn't get their right share. And as he was giving this talk before 250,000 people, the Spirit sort of seized him. And he departed from his prepared notes, which he usually had for his talks, and that's when he gave the famous I Have a Dream speech. I don't, in my own opinion, think it was just extemporaneously given. It was something he had worked on, I think, maybe as an alternate talk, but there came out that marvelous speech that so many of us remember. And then later in the year, November 22nd, and everyone remembers where they were on that occasion, at least most people in the room here, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated and King said he lost his best political ally. It was just then that they had really formed a partnership, and Kennedy was using many of his ideas and so on. And to follow that all up, Time magazine made Martin Luther King for 1963 the Man of the Year. So he really had, I think, achieved a great deal. Now, what do we get out of that? Now, I want to pick up the dream idea and the success idea, because one of the problems with freedom for us humans is we get paralyzed. We get into a rut. We get into a position where we can't seem to grab hold, where we're just going round and round, where we aren't making anything something of our life, when we're on dead center, when we feel depressed and despondent, something that Martin Luther King knew well throughout much of his life. Psychologists tell us, I'm drawing from Rollo May here, when he treats people who are depressed, one of the things that he has them do is to imagine alternatives. That they have to have a dream, in other words, a dream of where they want to get to. I often find that in marriage counseling, when people are just in a situation where they're just locked in and things are crummy, their mind says, why continue this? It'll always be crummy like this. And it seems like what you need to get off dead center is the sense it could be different. It's just to be able to imagine a situation where we could communicate without fighting. That often is the catalyst for making the first step in moving towards something better. We need a dream, in other words, to really get us going. I think we need little successes in life in order to become really free people. So often in his life, Martin Luther King said, we need a success. Something would go really badly. They would try to pick a target where they thought they could succeed because they had to show to the people in the movement nonviolence will work. And so I think that the little successes in life have to be grabbed onto if we're going to be free people. We have to celebrate. Sometimes they tell people, just imagine those successes. You're having trouble controlling your anger. Think to times when you had a good situation with this person you're mad at. Imagine it vividly. Get into it. Get into a time when it all went right and well. Carry that with you. And perhaps that dream or that image can come forward to help one when one is plagued with the anger problem. And finally, we need a sort of ultimate dream about life. That's a faith perspective. We need a dream of the kingdom, that the kingdom will come. A dream that says that somehow God will take care of things. And that's what Martin Luther King, I think, gave us in his great dream speech. It is a kingdom ideal. Everyone knows what he dreamed will never happen. Won't happen on this earth at this time. Martin Luther King knew that. It was a restatement of the kingdom that Jesus talked about, where you can, where there's shalom and justice and peace and harmony, and everybody gets along. The kind of dream that has driven religious people throughout history, and Martin Luther King, of course, enunciated that. If it is not to a prophetization to read this, whether one can read it without messing it up, I'm not sure, but the words are so magnificent that maybe it's worth a try. Remember that he gave the other, this is the end now, the Spirit had taken him over, and all of us who saw it on television and heard it so often, it sort of cascades throughout the imagination. I say to you today, my friends, that in spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a desert state sweltering with the heat of injustice and oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day the state of Alabama, whose governor's lips are presently dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, will be transformed into a situation where little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls and walk together as sisters and brothers. Well, it goes on, and it's powerful, and it is a restatement of the kingdom dream of living out the American dream that's contained in our founding documents and so on. And I think that what does that mean to us in a sense? What are we supposed to get out of that? I think it is the importance of having our own dream, of getting out of the rut, not settling in life for mediocrity, of having some personal dream that I'm trying to live out. Martin Luther King said, unless a man has something he's willing to die for, he's already dead. Got to have it. Got to have the dream, the cause, something that galvanizes us. And that, of course, in the Christian tradition is what we keep trying to resurrect in our liturgy, in our scripture reading and so on, is the kingdom. Jesus' dream of how the world ought to be and how the final kingdom will be. Well, as advertised, I will go over my hour. Bear with me. Now, I have some interim events here again. Year of 1964, finished his book on the Birmingham situation entitled Why We Can't Wait. July 2nd of 64, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill opening up all public accommodations in the South. That's what he was looking for. That was a great victory, but that left the problem of the voting rights. And during this time, he was really plagued by J. Edgar Hoover, who began bugging his hotel rooms and collecting evidence about Martin Luther King's extramarital affairs and keeping tapes of all that and even sending it to the President of the United States. He began that bugging early. In fact, John F. Kennedy took Martin Luther King out into the yard, Rose Garden, I guess it was, in the White House while he was still alive, and warned King that Hoover was doing this to him and was out to get him. And Hoover, throughout the whole time, always sent that material to influential people around the country and trying to discredit him. And also, during the same year when all this terrible trouble occurred, Martin Luther King received the Nobel Peace Prize, went to Oslo to receive it, and of course thereby gained worldwide recognition. That brings us to the events of Selma, 1965. For some people in the room here, this will ring very clear because I know they were there for the Selma marches and so on. The problem here was, I better tell this more succinctly, the voting rights problem. Their idea was to march from Selma to the Capitol in Montgomery and to try to secure the voting rights. And the problem was the blacks would come and stand in line to get registered, and they wouldn't register them. They'd stand there all day, and maybe one person might take the literacy test, hard test that even people with a degree might not be able to pass. And that's how they kept the blacks, of course, from voting. There was something under 5% of them registered in this area, and it was a simple matter. And who was that guy there? Sheriff Clark, yes. Especially brutal man, and Martin Luther King sort of liked that in a way. And anyway, started this march, and there was this great brutality that occurred, and then it was that Martin Luther King sent a note up to the north, to the ministers, the religious people, to come to Selma and help us in this march, and many people responded to that. There was something over 3,000 people involved in the march that left Selma, and they were fortunately protected by about 1,800 National Guards people, and most of the violence was averted, and those people walked about 7 miles of that 50-mile hike, and a select group of 300 then went on and arrived at Selma in sort of a triumphant thing, and Martin Luther King gave a very important speech on that particular occasion. So that was to secure the voting rights. That's what the main issue now was, that they could sit at lunch counters, had to go beyond that. But another important thing happened in 65, and that is that Martin Luther King began his stand against the war in Vietnam. The background of that is this, that he and Johnson had really become good friends. He thought that Lyndon Johnson was terrific. They were making progress. They got that bill passed and everything. And Martin Luther King knew what would happen if he opposed the war. And he did it anyway. Grandest gesture of conscience, perhaps, that he made throughout his life. And knowing that it would probably be to tremendous detriment to the civil rights movement in the United States, because he would lose the support of the president himself and most other people. But hardly anybody was opposing the war at that time besides Benjamin Spock, and it really was a difficult kind of thing. Well, one thing I would say that comes out of this, perhaps is the connection of freedom and courage. That, yeah, we're free to take hold of our lives, but very often there are stakes that are high. Very often it's hard to be a person of principle, and it seems that perhaps only a faith perspective that King had could move one to make that kind of renunciation act of all one dreamed for in order to be a person of principle. He opposed the war because he said it would be hypocritical for me to fight in favor of the people who are oppressed in our own country when people in Vietnam are being unjustly killed. In other words, he identified with the poor, the dispossessed, marginalized, all throughout the world. He was a man of grand vision. I'll give you a quote about how he thought one had to deal with the kind of fears that would come upon one in this kind of decision. He said, then what's the cure for the fear? He says, love casts out fear. This truth is not without a bearing on our personal anxieties. We're afraid of the superiority of other people, of failure, and of the scorn or disapproval of those whose opinions we most value. He knew that fear for sure in this case. Envy, jealousy, a lack of self-confidence, a feeling of insecurity, and a haunting sense of inferiority are all rooted in fear. We do not envy people and then fear them. First we fear them, and subsequently we become jealous of them. Is there a cure for these annoying fears that pervert our personal lives? Yes, a deep and abiding commitment to the way of love. Perfect love casts out fear. Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that. Hatred paralyzes life. Love releases it. Hatred confuses life. Love harmonizes it. Hatred darkens life. Love illumines it. So we learned something perhaps from him about love casting out fear. I'm on my last section now, bear with me. And that is, I'm entitling Chicago 1966 and Beyond. It is the last part of his life. So he felt he had to go north because the job wasn't just in the South. He would pick Chicago. He went and lived in the slums of Chicago, tried to overcome this bad slum conditions there, encountered Mayor Daley, all kinds of difficulties and problems in that. Very unsuccessful campaign. The president was against him. Hoover kept sending this dossiers on his sexual activities out to all kinds of people, the newspapers, trying to discredit him and so on. On April 7th of 67, despite all of this, he went to the Riverside Church and gave his most famous speech in opposition to the war in Vietnam. And by and large, it seems as though the Chicago period is a period of failure. And as this goes on, as he's being attacked from all sides, even the black militants now turned against him. The sign Black Power came in with Stokely Carmichael. He rejected that in part. The other blacks said that he was an Uncle Tom, that he sold out too easily. The administration was against him. Some of his close aides were opposed to his new plan of a march on Washington. Bayard Rustin, who stayed with him through thick and thin, thought the idea of them poor people's campaign on Washington was crazy, didn't like it. He became despondent. Ralph Abernathy said he had periods of time when he just was sort of incoherent. Earlier, Hoover had sent a copy of this tape of his sexual activities to Martin Luther King himself. He played it for his wife.